It was the summer of 2018, and I was driving home after a late shift at work. My job was about 45 minutes from my house, and the route back took me through a stretch of desert highway that seemed to go on forever. At night, the emptiness felt even more pronounced. No lights, no buildings, just miles of sand, scrub, and the occasional cactus silhouetted against the moonlight. That night, the air was still and warm, with the kind of silence that made every sound feel magnified. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and little else. I was alone on the road, or so I thought. I was about 20 minutes from home when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched scream that seemed to come from somewhere off the road. I slowed down, scanning the desert on either side. My windows were rolled up, but the sound cut through the hum of the engine like a knife. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, but it sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, my phone flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The scream came again, louder this time, and it sounded unmistakably like a woman crying for help. It was coming from the desert, somewhere off to my right. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. I took a few cautious steps toward the sound, my shoes crunching on the dry gravel. The desert was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. Just as I was about to call out again, the scream started up once more, now sounding even farther away. It was as if the source of the sound was moving deeper into the desert. Every instinct in me screamed to get back in the car and leave, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe it was guilt. What if someone really was out there, hurt or in danger? I walked a little further, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the uneven ground. "Where are you?" I shouted. The only answer was the crying, which seemed to echo all around me. It was impossible to pinpoint its exact location, and the more I listened, the less natural it sounded. The tone was too consistent, too deliberate, like a recording being played on a loop. That's when I stopped. Something about the sound finally registered as wrong, inhuman. My heart started to race as I realized I might be walking into a trap. I turned around and started back toward my car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking barefoot on the hard-packed sand. But they grew louder, quicker, as if whoever, or whatever, was following me was gaining speed. I broke into a sprint, my lungs burning as I ran toward the faint outline of my car in the distance. The footsteps kept pace, relentless and unervingly close. The crying had stopped entirely, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the night air. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The growling stopped, and for a moment, the world was silent again. Then something slammed into the back of the car. The force of the impact shook the entire vehicle, and I screamed as I threw the car into drive. I didn't care about the speed limit or the condition of the road. I just needed to get out of there. My tires kicked up a cloud of dust as I sped away, the dark desert blurring past my windows. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, miles from where I'd stopped, that I dared to look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me but empty highway and darkness. My heart was still pounding as I drove the rest of the way home, my eyes darting to the mirror every few seconds. When I got home, I checked the car for damage. The rear bumper had a massive dent, as if something heavy had slammed into it. But there were no scratches, no paint transfer, just the dent. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever had been out there wasn't natural. And to this day, I can't drive that stretch of highway at night without feeling like something is watching me, waiting for me to stop. It was the winter of 2016, and I was driving home from visiting my parents in Houston. I had planned to leave earlier in the day, but a mix of bad weather and last-minute errands meant I didn't hit the road until after sunset. The drive was supposed to take about 3 hours, but with the heavy fog rolling in, I knew it might take longer. The highway was quiet that night, with only the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. Thick patches of fog clung to the road, swallowing the light from my high beams. The air felt heavy, and the darkness pressed in on me from all sides. I turned up the radio to keep myself company, the low hum of country music helping to calm my nerves. About an hour into the drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another late-night traveler. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was a truck. Its headlights were unusually bright, and they seemed to waver slightly, like they were flickering. The truck followed me for several miles, keeping a steady pace just far enough behind that I couldn't make out its details. I adjusted my rearview mirror, trying to get a better look, but the fog distorted everything. Still, something about it felt wrong. It was too quiet, too smooth. No rumble of an engine, no sound of tires on the pavement, just the headlights, glowing unnaturally in the mist. I slowed down slightly, hoping the truck would pass me, but it stayed right where it was, matching my speed. I sped up, and it did the same. My heart started to race as I realized it was deliberately following me. Just a coincidence, I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel tighter. After another few miles, the truck suddenly surged forward, its headlights growing brighter as it closed the distance between us. For a moment, I thought it was going to rear-end me, and I braced for impact. But at the last second, it swerved into the left lane and pulled up alongside me. That's when I saw it. The truck was old, a rusted relic from decades past, with a cracked windshield and a dented hood. Its paint was a faded black, peeling away in large patches, and its headlights flickered erratically. But what struck me most was the driver, or rather, the lack of one. The cab was empty. No hands on the wheel, no silhouette in the driver's seat. Just darkness. My chest tightened as the truck kept pace with me, its headlights casting an eerie glow over the inside of my car. I tried not to look, but my eyes kept darting toward it, half expecting someone, or something, to appear behind the wheel. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck began to slow down. It drifted back into the right lane and fell behind me, its flickering headlights growing dimmer and dimmer until they vanished into the fog. For a moment, I thought it was over. I even laughed nervously, convincing myself it had been some bizarre optical illusion or a prank. But as I rounded a curve in the highway, my blood ran cold. The truck was in front of me. It sat in the middle of the road, its headlights off, like a shadow waiting to swallow the light. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car skidded to a stop just a few feet from the truck's bumper. I sat there, shaking, my breath fogging up the windshield. The truck didn't move. Its taillights were dark, and the cab was still empty. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. Then the lights came back on, blindingly bright. They flooded my car, washing out everything in a sea of white. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning as I tried to back away. But the truck didn't follow. Instead, it slowly rolled forward, disappearing into the fog like a ghost fading into the night. When I finally regained my composure, I drove past the spot where it had been, half expecting to find it waiting for me. But the road was empty. There were no tire tracks, no sign that the truck had ever been there. I didn't stop until I reached the next gas station, where I parked under the bright lights and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I told myself it was a trick of the fog, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. A few weeks later, I mentioned the incident to a coworker, and his face went pale. He told me about a local legend, an old truck that haunted that stretch of highway, appearing to travelers who were alone at night. Some said it was cursed, the spirit of a driver who had died in a wreck decades ago. Others believed it was a warning, a harbinger of danger. I haven't driven that road since, and sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone on the highway, I check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those flickering headlights trailing behind me. It was late spring in 2020, and I was on my way back from a weekend spent with friends in a small town outside of Austin. The drive home took me through a rural stretch of Texas that was sparsely populated and poorly lit. The highway was mostly straight, cutting through vast fields and the occasional patch of dense trees. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I saw the sign for a detour. Construction had apparently closed part of the main highway, and I was rerouted onto a smaller, older road that I'd never traveled before. I hesitated, but there wasn't much choice. My GPS confirmed the new route would only add a few minutes to the trip, so I followed the detour. The road was narrow and winding, with no shoulder and trees pressing in close on either side. My headlights barely seemed to penetrate the darkness, and every curve felt sharper than the last. After about 15 minutes, the road straightened, and I saw a bridge up ahead. It was old, made of rusting metal and weathered wooden planks that creaked under the weight of my car. As I approached, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the bridge. A woman, her figure illuminated by my headlights. She was wearing a long, white dress that hung loosely on her frame, and her dark hair was tangled and wild. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring out over the side of the bridge into the water below. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. The road was too narrow to go around her, and something about her stillness made my stomach twist. I rolled down my window slightly and called out, "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Her head was tilted slightly downward, and her hair obscured most of her face. The only movement was the faint rustling of her dress in the breeze. I considered backing up and turning around, but the road behind me was long and winding, and the thought of reversing all the way back was just as unsettling as facing her. So I took a deep breath and decided to inch forward, hoping she'd step aside. As my car crept closer, the woman suddenly turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes were dark and sunken, as if she hadn't slept in years. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, and for a moment, I thought she was silently pleading with me. Then her expression shifted, and her lips twisted into a smile that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude. It was a grin, wide and unnatural, like her face had been stretched too far. Her teeth were sharp, jagged, and glinted faintly in the light of my high beams. I panicked, slamming my foot on the gas. My car lurched forward, and I swerved around her, the tires screeching on the old wooden planks of the bridge. As I passed her, I caught a glimpse in my side mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She was running after me. Her movements were jerky and inhuman, as if her limbs didn't quite work the way they should. She covered the distance between us far too quickly, her figure growing larger in my rearview mirror. I floored it, my car rattling as it sped over the bridge and back onto solid pavement. When I glanced back again, she was gone. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly 20 miles away. My hands were shaking as I stumbled out of the car and into the brightly lit convenience store. The clerk gave me a concerned look, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. Later, I learned about the legend of the bridge woman. Locals claimed she was the spirit of a woman who had drowned herself in the river decades ago after losing her family in a car accident. They said she appeared to lone travelers, trying to lure them into the water to share her fate. I don't know what I saw that night, but I haven't taken that detour again. And sometimes, when I cross bridges at night, I find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter, watching for any sign of her in the darkness. It was a rainy night in late autumn of 2017, and I was heading home from a business trip in West Texas. The weather had been unpredictable all week, but that night, the rain came down in heavy sheets, and the wind howled through the barren landscape. The interstate was slick and deserted, with only the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the endless storm. I was about 2 hours into the drive when I saw the lights. At first, they were just faint glimmers in the distance, barely visible through the downpour. As I got closer, I realized it was a convoy of vehicles. 3 large trucks moving slowly, their taillights blinking rhythmically in the storm. Something about their uniform movement caught my attention. They were driving close together, too close, like they were tethered by an invisible chain. I slowed down, keeping a safe distance. The rain made it hard to see, but I could just make out the outlines of the trucks. They were old, their paint chipped and faded, with no visible logos or markings. The rear truck's taillights flickered occasionally, almost as if they were on the verge of going out. I decided to pass them, figuring they were just transport trucks struggling in the storm. I turned on my blinker, moved into the left lane, and accelerated. As I came up alongside the convoy, I glanced at the first truck. The cab was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. My car skidded slightly on the wet road, and I pulled back into the right lane, falling behind the convoy once more. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Maybe the rain had obscured my vision, but as I stared at the trucks ahead, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. I tried again, this time focusing on the middle truck. As I pulled up alongside it, I shined my high beams directly at the cab. It, too, was empty. The steering wheel turned on its own, the windshield wipers moving rhythmically against the rain. My stomach twisted as I realized the third truck would be the same. I fell back, not daring to pass the lead truck. The convoy continued moving steadily, their taillights blinking in perfect unison. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I debated whether to pull over and wait for them to disappear into the storm. That's when they stopped. All three trucks came to a sudden halt in the middle of the interstate, their brake lights flaring red through the rain. I slammed on my brakes to avoid hitting them, my car coming to a skidding stop a few yards behind the last truck. The rain hammered against my windshield as I sat there, frozen, wondering what to do. Then the lights went out. The trucks disappeared, swallowed by the storm. One moment they were there, hulking and ominous, and the next, I was staring at an empty stretch of highway. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the road ahead was completely clear. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before inching forward, my high beams sweeping the rain-soaked asphalt. There were no tire tracks, no sign that the trucks had ever been there. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain and the low hum of my engine. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, my mind replaying the sight of those empty cabs and the strange, synchronized movement of the trucks. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the rain running down the windows and wondering what I had witnessed. A few weeks later, I mentioned the incident to a friend who worked as a long-haul trucker. His face went pale when I described the convoy. "Did you see any markings on the trucks?" he asked. "No," I said. "They were completely unmarked." He nodded grimly. "You're lucky they didn't stop for you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated before telling me about a legend among truckers, a phantom convoy that appears on desolate highways during storms. They say the trucks are driven by the restless spirits of drivers who died in crashes, bound together in an endless journey. Some believe they're harmless, a ghostly reminder of the dangers of the road. Others claim they lure drivers off the highway, leading them to their deaths. I don't know what I saw that night, but I haven't driven through a storm since. And whenever I see a convoy of trucks on the highway, I can't help but wonder if they're real, or if they're waiting for me to follow. It was the spring of 2019, and I was driving home from a weekend visit with my grandparents in a small town on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. The weather had been clear all day, but as the sun set and the horizon darkened, the clouds rolled in. By the time I hit the highway, a steady rain was coming down, turning the road into a slick, glistening ribbon. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and the familiarity of it was almost comforting. The highway was surrounded by open fields on either side, with only the occasional farmhouse or roadside diner breaking up the monotony. My favorite true crime podcast played softly through the speakers, helping to keep me focused as the rain drummed against the car. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by my headlights, but as I got closer, I saw it was a man standing on the shoulder, completely still. He was drenched from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his body as if he'd been caught in the rain for hours. He didn't flag me down or make any motion to suggest he needed help. He just stood there, staring straight ahead. As I passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face in the rearview mirror. His expression was blank, almost lifeless, and his eyes seemed to follow my car. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively pressed the gas, wanting to put as much distance between myself and him as possible. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was probably just a stranded motorist waiting for help. But about 10 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he was standing under an overpass, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. It was unmistakably the same man. Same drenched clothes, same blank expression. My heart started to race as I sped past him, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. My hands tightened on the wheel as the rain intensified, the wipers struggling to keep up. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept going back to the man. How had he gotten ahead of me so quickly? Was he hitchhiking? Or was I just imagining things? About 20 minutes later, I decided to pull into a rest stop to use the bathroom and grab a coffee. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of parked semis and a lone sedan. I made my way inside, the fluorescent lights and warmth of the building a welcome relief from the storm outside. As I stood in line at the counter, I glanced out the window and froze. He was there. The man was standing under one of the parking lot lights, staring directly at my car. His wet clothes clung to his frame, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to peer into the car's interior. My heart raced as I turned away, gripping the counter to steady myself. "Are you okay?" the cashier asked, her voice pulling me back to reality. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." I grabbed my coffee and hurried back to the car, avoiding another glance at the parking lot. When I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the empty parking space where the man had been standing. He was gone. The rain was still coming down hard as I merged back onto the highway, my nerves frayed and my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that I was overreacting, but every mile felt heavier, every shadow on the roadside more menacing. Then I saw him again. This time, he was in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just a few feet from where he stood. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared at me with those empty, lifeless eyes. The rain pounded on the windshield, and for a moment, I was frozen, unsure of what to do. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or even a mocking one. It was wrong, stretched too wide across his face, as if his skin didn't quite fit. My breath caught in my throat as he raised one hand and pointed directly at me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel and veering onto the shoulder to get around him. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. By the time I got home, the rain had stopped and the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror and trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination, a combination of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the storm. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something on the passenger side window. A handprint. It was smeared, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass and dragged it downward. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the faint outline of fingers still visible in the early morning light. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since, and whenever it rains, I catch myself glancing at the side of the road, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for me to stop. In the fall of 2018, I was driving through the vast, empty highways of Central Texas, heading home after a work conference. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the road stretched endlessly ahead, a narrow band of asphalt cutting through fields of dry grass. The radio wasn't picking up any stations, and the silence in the car felt almost suffocating. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge, watching as it crept closer to empty. Finally, the glowing sign of a gas station appeared in the distance, a beacon of light in the otherwise endless darkness. Relieved, I pulled in and parked next to one of the pumps. The station was old and run down, with flickering fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. A rusted pickup truck was parked near the building, its bed filled with junk, but there was no sign of its driver. I stepped out of the car, the night air cool against my skin. As I filled the tank, I glanced toward the small convenience store attached to the station. The windows were dark, and a handwritten, "Open" sign hung crookedly on the door. My unease grew as I realized how quiet it was. No hum of refrigerators, no crickets chirping, just silence. As I replaced the gas nozzle and prepared to leave, I heard the creak of the store's door opening. A man stepped out, tall and thin, his features obscured by the shadows. He wore a faded baseball cap pulled low over his face and a heavy jacket that seemed too warm for the cool night. He paused on the threshold, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just getting gas. Heading out now?" The man nodded but didn't move. He just stood there, watching as I climbed back into my car. My heart was racing as I started the engine, eager to put some distance between myself and the strange man. As I pulled out of the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, his face turned toward my car. The road ahead was empty, a long, straight stretch illuminated only by my headlights. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself it was just a weird moment. But about 10 minutes later, my stomach dropped. Headlights appeared in the distance behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car on the highway, but as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was the rusted pickup truck from the gas station. It stayed far enough back that I couldn't make out the driver, but the way it followed me, steadily, persistently, set my nerves on edge. I pressed the gas, increasing my speed, but the truck kept pace. My hands gripped the wheel as I debated whether to pull over or try to lose it. The highway was completely deserted, and the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck veered off the road and disappeared into the darkness. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. A few miles later, the headlights reappeared, this time from a side road up ahead. The truck pulled onto the highway and fell in behind me once again. I was terrified. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he just messing with me? Or was this something more sinister? I reached for my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The highway was a dead zone, and the nearest town was still miles away. I spotted an exit sign for a small rest stop and made a split-second decision. I veered onto the ramp, hoping to lose the truck in the process. The rest stop was little more than a parking lot with a few picnic tables and an old vending machine. I parked under one of the dim streetlights and waited, watching the highway in my rearview mirror. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of the truck. I started to think I'd lost him when a movement in the shadows caught my eye. The man from the gas station was standing near the vending machine. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen another car on the highway. There was no way he could have gotten here without following me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. He was far enough away that he hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I turned off my headlights and slid low in the seat, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, ready to start the engine if he came any closer. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked into the shadows. I waited, holding my breath, until I was sure he was gone. Then I started the car and sped out of the rest stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop again until I reached the lights of the next town. I parked in a well-lit gas station and went inside to catch my breath. The clerk looked at me with concern as I recounted what had happened, but all he could do was shrug. "People around here can be strange," he said. "I never saw the man, or the truck, again. But even now, years later, I still avoid driving that stretch of highway at night. And whenever I stop at a gas station, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a rusted pickup truck waiting in the shadows."